Okay, hello, my name is Zain Al-Qazi. I am a postdoctoral candidate at the New Political Economy Initiative, or NPEI, at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Welcome to the fourth seminar of Economic Histories of the Global South, a seminar series organized by the NPEI in collaboration with the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT. The NPI aims to construct a structural vision of the Indian economy toward building an alternative socio-economic paradigm to neoliberalism. The Economic Histories of the Global South seminar series speaks to this initiative by bringing together economic, business, labor, and agrarian histories in an effort to build an integrated image of the Global South's past to inform its present and future. You can visit npei.in to learn more about the initiative and the seminar series. So today we have a paper presentation by Benjamin Siegel titled Automatic for the People, Labor, Machines, and Ecology in Modern India. We will first have Ben speak for 40 minutes, after which we will have 20 minutes for comments by Nasir Tyabji. Finally, we will have 20 minutes for a general discussion. If you would like to ask a question to any of the speakers, please type it out in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, anytime during today's seminar. So we'll start with Ben's paper. Benjamin Siegel is Associate Professor of South Asian and Transnational History at Boston University. His last book, Hungry Nation, Food, Famine, and the Making of Modern India, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. His next book, The Ghost Ship, Pharmaceutical Opioids and Political Power in the Modern World, will be published by Oxford University Press. Okay, Ben, so over to you.
Thank you so much for bearing with me and for having me to the seminar series. Very big appreciation to you, Zain, to Professor Tyabji for making this talk and the conversation that comes afterwards possible. I really wish I could be there with you in person. It's probably much nicer in Bombay than it is in very rainy Boston. It's a real honor to have Professor Tyabji responding to this paper since I've admired your work for a very long time. So I'm going to present today something that is much more a research agenda than a fleshed out project. I want to invite you to help me think through what to do with it. I see myself in this paper as building upon a longer project of understanding the nature of resources very broadly constituted in modern India. In my work up until now, I focused on material resources, mostly agricultural ones, and how they get incorporated into particular projects of state building at different scales. And I did that in my first book through the lens of food and its conscription into the work of nation building. In that second book that you, Zain, just mentioned, I think it should be out at the end of the year, I looked to the raw materials for pharmaceuticals as an area where Indian actors negotiated their incorporation into that work and then into global systems of commodity production. My work in this paper is on a much more ineffable resource, and that's Indian labor and the purpose of Indian work itself. So to do that, I'm going to try to bring together a few different historiographies. The first on labor, the second on population, reproduction, and ecology. And then in thinking through a number of specific technologies, I want to look at how Indian life and labor have been differentially sutured together and conjured up over about the last century and a half. So I'm going to speed run through two of these historiographies. I think some of this will be more familiar to the seminar participants. And then I'm going to offer a look at three different visions of how Indian labor was to be marshaled or is to be marshaled, focusing on those different technologies and what they bring together. I think the first part of the talk is more the gruel, and then the second part is the dessert. And my sincere hope is that this is going to make sense as we go along. So I'm going to start with this familiar prediction that Karl Marx made in 1853. Marx, of course, was looking at the construction of the railways, and he predicted that the infrastructure then used for India's exploitation would in time become the means for its industrial development. And this is a line that many of you, I'm sure, know, but he wrote that the English millocracy intend to endow India with railways with the exclusive view of extracting raw materials for their manufactures. But you can't maintain a net of railways over an immense country without introducing all those industrial processes necessary to meet the immediate and current wants of railway locomotion, and out of which there must grow the application of machinery to those branches of industry not immediately connected with the railways. Again, this is a prediction that I think most of you know. It's this radical prediction about India's future, that the railway would usher in India's inevitable development as an industrial colossus. So many of us are familiar with that prediction, and also perhaps with how, for a certain class of English-educated Indian thinkers in the decades that followed, the promise of India's industrialized future became something of an object of faith. Mechanization, the amplification of labor through machines, was going to be the key to that future. And many Indians saw clearly that they would need to master new machines to yoke the nation towards its future. And Kunte, who was a high school headmaster from Pune, was an emblematic figure in that regard. And he argued in 1885 that Indians who wanted future prosperity should, quote, spread widely the art of mechanization. Now, his understanding of what that entailed was very dim. Kunti lauded blacksmithing as the apotheosis of mechanization. But even if his command of important technologies was hazy, his actual vision was not. He said that the mastery of machines was a kalpavriksha, a wish-granting tree that would bring India into what Thomas Carlyle had 50 years prior called the age of machinery. So the idea of a person or of people being mechanically minded had emerged in the 1820s in England in the crux of the Industrial Revolution. But by the 1880s, arguments over whether or not Indians were similarly minded were playing out in many vernacular newspapers. And if you look at the first chapter or two of Ross Bassett's Technological Indian from about, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, there's a really great account of those debates over what it meant to be mechanically minded. I'm going to leave aside, but maybe just note the later emergence of the term jacquard to conjure up a really different approach to what you might think of as techne or problem solving. So, in any case, by this time, the late 19th century, most debates over Indian mechanization had come to be tied to one specific context, and that was the transformation of cotton into yarn and then into cloth. And in a century when India's weavers had been thrown into overlapping and recurrent crises by the flood of cheap imported textiles, mechanization in yarn production offered a means for Indians to produce and then to compete. And of course, I'm giving this talk at IIT Bombay. This is a Western Indian story. It is very much a Bombay story. In 1856, Kawazi Nanabhoy Devar installed a new type of frame in his second cotton mill. And the throstle frame, which was an oversized and spindly machine, you can see a version of it here, topped with 64 bobbins of yarn, could be worked continuously as opposed to in shifts. And the arithmetic there was very simple, that fewer workers could produce more and sturdier yarn. And of course, the most famous convert to this technology was Jamshedji Tata. And shortly after converting his defunct oil pressing facility into his first cotton mill, Tata wrote exuberantly of how Indian workers, empowered by that technology, would then compete in higher value markets. Let me break the fourth wall for a second. Some of you, like me, teach or study at different points the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And when I teach, I always move very quickly from the transformation of Bombay labor to the first stirrings of the Swadeshi movement, then to the Gandhian embrace of khadi and the charkha. I've been trying to read this period over the last couple months a bit more slowly and to pay attention to the very specific machines and technologies within it. Jogendranath Chattapati, writing in his newspaper, The Swadeshi, argued forcefully against the Indian embrace of machines. He wrote that the Serampur mill has become the property of Bengalis is no doubt a matter for joy, but the less we have of textile mills, the better it is for the country. Machines enhance the suffering of the common people. They benefit only the rich handful. Independent professions are destroyed, laborers increase in numbers, and in time are totally debased. About 2 decades later, when Gandhi wrote in Young India that he refused to be dazzled by the seeming triumph of machinery, it was specifically mills with throstle frames that he was writing about and conjuring up. A lot of great writing on this period, including slightly older work by Lisa Trivedi and Douglas Haynes, has looked closely to the material and technological dimensions of all of these new modes of production. But the bulk of the work has followed the mills in Bombay, and it's historiographically echoed Hobsbawm's much later notion that whoever says industrial revolution says cotton, or for that matter, Nehru's sweeping claim that the history of India may well be written with textile as its leading motif. So I'll come back to this divergence in a little bit, but in the meantime, let's follow the mechanists. In promoting India's modernization through mechanization, Kunte and Ambar and Tata and many others were all envisioning what 20th century economists would much later affirm, that the industrial production of textiles represented the first step on the path to industrialization. Now, every bit of available evidence would have convinced them of this. Competition from cheap British-made goods, colonial protectionism, reliance on imported machinery, those were all real constraints. But speculative capital was flowing to Bombay mills in the wake of the Civil War. Cotton was, of course, India's heritage, and its population was both a vast market and labor pool. Indian mills were importing their machines from Lancashire, but that also meant that they were using the same machines, and they very often employed the same technical directors. So I think it was possible then to be optimistic. Mechanically minded Indians, and fewer of them, would use machines to amplify productive capacity and that of the nation. Now, we can forgive the optimists of that era for failing to consider the logical next question, which is what would all those Indian workers do as factory labor produced more and more with fewer humans in them? They didn't have to linger on that question because, of course, the reckoning was forestalled. Somewhere along the way, the Bombay mills languished, industrialization only partially came. This is in scare quotes. India would eventually leapfrog very strangely into the service sector, getting patchy gains in industrialization in moments like the second five-year planning period. So I'll just pause here to say that the literature on India's failure to alchemize its textile production into the basis of a robust industrial economy is, of course, a massive debate in economics and history and economic history. A lot of that debate is oblique, and it's told as a story of divergence. In 1890, Indian and Japanese cotton spinning mills had about the same access to capital and labor productivity. They used the same machines, they had similar management structures, and then their trajectories radically split. By 1938, Japanese cotton mills had more than quintupled their output per worker hour with essentially very little capital advantage, while Indian mills' labor productivity had essentially stagnated. You know, of course, the debates in labor history that this divergence engendered. The earliest historians and economists to take this on in the 1960s foregrounded two distinct features of the Bombay mills. The first was the managing agency system, where old firms undertook the management of new mills on commission. The second was the jobber system, where foremen recruited, trained, and disciplined workers from mostly Marathi-speaking villages for their factories. And most subsequent work has taken their cues from that. Labor historians have offered different accounts of the ways in which mill workers negotiated the incorporation of their labor into Indian industrial production. They've charted the prolonged, extended decline of Bombay's mills. Economic historians and economists have been a little more pointed in their search for the various inefficiencies that hindered industrial growth. All of this is good and interesting, and I think known terrain. I think these debates also skirt a more interesting set of questions about Indian people and labor themselves. In the waning decades of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th, other far-sighted Indian thinkers, both votaries of Swadeshi and those who had really little time for it, were also coming to imagine the logical consequences of successful mechanization and industrialization. Land, while strained and depleted, would eventually require fewer people to work on it. Factories, for many indignities, would employ fewer people to produce in them. So what then were other Indians to do? That's a question of the 21st century and one to which I'll return, but it's also a vision that was swirling at the end of the 19th. You're probably a couple steps ahead of me in connecting this to a different set of questions on population, so let me now take us there. So 50 years ago, the political scientist Mahmoud Mamdani published a short account of the Khanna study, which, as you'll likely know, is the Rockefeller-funded birth control scheme in Ludhiana, Punjab. Mamdani's argument was really simple. It was a refutation of the neo-Malthusian scare literature that had blossomed in the wake of books like Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, published in 1968. And he concluded that overpopulation didn't cause poverty, but that people had large families because they were poor. This was the kind of seminal early intervention. And the myth of population control in time inspired a wave of later skeptical histories of Indian reproduction, family planning, and population. All this work has been big and quite forceful. Sarah Hodges, Sanjay Maluwalia have shown how Indian and international idioms of family planning, eugenics, and domesticity all traveled together, fomenting false fears at home and abroad that India was overpopulated. International historians like Matthew Connolly or Alison Bashford later came to see India as a linchpin in larger conversations about demography, carrying capacity, and reproduction. And they read figures like Radha Kamal Mukherjee, as well as Ranade, Anik Besant, Kamladevi Chattopadhyay, Devanti Rama Rao, as central interlocutors who were thinking through the political implications of India's large population. Again, I think something is kind of missing in that take. Maithili Srinivas, in her really excellent new book on reproduction, argues for a more expansive but also localized account of population, land, migration, and sovereignty. He borrows from Anne Murphy's work on economization, which itself is theorized from questions of reproduction in modern Bangladesh. And she offers the idea of Indians economizing reproduction in the 19th and 20th centuries, of drawing up economic calculation and measurement into processes of human life. So most of this literature on population takes its, I think, appropriately skeptical tone from Indian family planning's troubling co-constitution with the logics of eugenics. It reminds us that India's population was not in fact growing at any appreciable great rate at the turn of the 20th century. Kept in check by famine, disease, infant mortality, it really wouldn't do so until just slightly before independence. But what was clearly occurring in this period, as a number of environmental historians have shown us recently, was an increase in both real and visible pressures on land, natural resources, and cities. Again, this is my cue to ask a somewhat different question, which is tied once more to the purpose in scare quotes again, of Indian life. When I teach the 19th century in India, one heuristic that I employ is that this was the age of counting in new ways. The high noon of colonial extraction was also the birth of the census, the survey, new catalogs of caste and ethnicity, the logic of racial balance in the military. But it's also a period of wrangling anew with the idea of people and large numbers of them. So questions of population and reproduction, like the logic of the mill and the machine, they seem to me like they were calling to the fore the question of what Indians were to do in the 20th century, how eventually their labor was to be marshaled, organized, valued, or maybe even transcended. So I know this is somewhat abstract. Let me try to illustrate a bit of what I'm talking about. And this is the question about the productive capacity and purpose of Indian people and labor through three different machines or technologies that in the last 100 years have proposed different configurations of bodies and work. To me, they also represent a certain chronology, the movement from a production economy to a service economy to a post-service economy. That is, I think, useful and also a bit overdetermined. And again, you've suffered through the gruel, so let me try to get you to some of the good stuff right now. Let me start first with the ambar charkha, which is in part the subject of a really great dissertation, an unpublished dissertation by Leslie Hempson from the University of Michigan. There's no more iconic image in Indian nationalism than, as you see on the left, of course, the upright spinning wheel. But even votaries of that modest technology were also subject to the pressure to mechanize and improve its output. As Gandhi reinvented himself as a rustic, he had to discover the charkha. After he returned to India in 1915, he and his ashram associates wanted to provide yarn to its hired handloom weavers, but Gandhi found it really hard to find a usable device. He complained to a friend that, quote, quite a number of people in Gujarat had spinning wheels in their homes, but had long since consigned them to the lofts as useless lumber. A woman named Gangaben Majumdar finally helped Gandhi locate a functional upright model, which was already more high-tech than the box version. And Gandhi was, and this will come as no great surprise, profoundly disappointed by the machine. It produced really small quantities of inconsistent yarn. It couldn't do the work of spinning and winding simultaneously. And at best, it made a spinner about 3 paise a day at a time when the average daily income was about 7. So 2 years after learning to spin, Gandhi persuaded a wealthy friend to sponsor a competition for an improved model. And he gave a really princely reward. He held out 5,000 rupees as prize money. That competition started in 1920, but even after the prize money got doubled a decade on, no model was good enough. Now, to me, this is a really strange vision of Gandhi and his associates. It's a relentless focus on efficiency, really at odds with the later breathless praise of the upright spinning wheel as the epitome of Indian village production. The device was, yes, supposed to be used in the service of the village alone, but it needed to be quicker, more efficient, and allow a single worker to produce more. 2 years after Gandhi's death, a 29-year-old amateur engineer from Madras won the competition with his proposal for this machine called the ambar charkha. It was a compact box. You can see a sketch of it here. It was often compared to a very large typewriter. And it had 3 interlinked systems inside of it. There was a spinning wheel, there was a carding machine, and then a drawing machine. And its 4 spindles that operated together made it quadruply more productive than the upright version, with a similar advantage to a villager's potential income. So for a few brief years, India's Khadi and Village Industries Commission promoted that new machine as a revolutionary technology for rural production and India's economic life. Members in and outside of the commission debated whether or not that mechanized production actually represented Khadi at all. J.C. Kumarappa was squarely of the belief that it was un-Gandhian, though other members said that the Khadi-ness of the cloth was tied more to the spirit and the intent of the weaver himself. So casting it as the apotheosis of Indian rural production, the commission planned to introduce 2.5 million units to rural weavers with the aim of boosting village production. I don't know if you can read the text on the cartoon it right, but I absolutely love this vision here of there's a recently laid off worker. He's lost his job, and his friend is comforted. He's comforting his friend. He's being comforted by his friend, and he reassures him that there's no problem. I have an ambar charkha. My wife works on it, and I'll help her until I find a new job. This seems like cold comfort to me, but perhaps I'm not as optimistic as the author of that comic. So, like so many post-independence Gandhian schemes, this failed. These are stills here from a films division promotional video on the ambar charkha. So the machine was too mechanized for purists in Khadi. It was also fully at odds with the industrial imperatives of planning at that moment. The epitaph delivered in a 1959 evaluation confirmed that no weaver really wanted this strange machine that couldn't deliver on its promise of better employment and income. So when I back off for a second, there's something in this machine that pushed forward the same question about the productive capacity and purpose of Indian labor. What in an era of steel and factories and dams were Indians to do with their work? Let me try a slightly different and slightly later case study. And I'm drawing this largely from the work of the architect and architectural historian Priya Jain. Like the example of the ambar charkha, I read it as literally and conceptually derivative of many of the debates that were born in and around the Bombay mills. Volkart Brothers was a Swiss trading house. It was founded in 1851, and it had offices in Winterthur, Switzerland, as well as in Bombay. And by the late 19th century, it had become one of the largest trading firms in colonial India. It exported raw materials like cotton, tea, oils, while importing European manufactured goods like soap, paper, matches, and machinery. And in 1923, the firm opened an engineering division in Bombay, whose flagship unit was a refrigeration department. Their executives had the singular goal of bringing cooling to India. They declared that they would replace the ubiquitous icebox with a household refrigerator and the pankhas, the fans, and the water coolers with air conditioning. Work was not immediately central to Volkart's vision of air conditioning. The technology initially came to military contexts. It was installed for the first time in an ammunition factory in Bombay. A decade later, the first civilian air conditioning in India came to the Regal Cinema, the Taj Mahal Hotel. But the so-called comfort sector for air conditioning was less important in time than the industrial one. Volkart's marketers drew upon the work and calculations of Radhakama Mukherjee and others to claim that air conditioning in factories would increase worker productivity by 4 to 8%. And it would make up the putative difference in efficiency between a European worker and an Indian one. Again, the kind of racial labor logic of the moment. But by independence, air conditioning was primarily being sold not to the factory, but to the office. The isolation that it offered was said to offer from noise, from germs, from heat, and particulate matter were framed as benefits to the lawyer, to the doctor, and to other so-called professional men. So 7 years after independence, Volkart Brothers formed a partnership with Tata, and the new firm Voltas installed its air conditioners in showy retrofitted spaces like the Reserve Bank of India and the National Physical Laboratory, where access to cool temperatures was offered as a perk to managers and directors, and only much later extended to their juniors. We, of course, could move. We could move with time. Fast forward to the present, where India's AC market is the largest and fastest growing market on the planet, and where the basic conditions of life and labor are really sutured to its accessibility. But for now, as I move to a third and a final example, I want to just suffice it to say that in air conditioning, Indian thinkers were positing another set of relationships between machines, people, and their labor. And here are the very explicitly environmental conditions in which the former might selectively amplify a certain form of labor. I want to think through in this last example what I'm just provocatively going to frame as the end of Indian labor. For many modernization theorists and economists and many economic sociologists, many of India's post-colonial particularities are framed in terms of its, again, scare quotes, failure to adhere to a familiar developmental arc. And that's the transition from the agricultural economy to the industrial one, and in time, eventually to one of services. We know, of course, how India has confounded that trajectory and how the post-service economy globally is the black box of labor's future. We just don't know what labor will look like. But in this context, let me offer a last technology where Indian labor is being reconfigured again, this time as a certain form of commodity that, to use the that's soon, to use the anthropologist Julie Livingston's phrase, will self-devour. In the early 2010s, a husband and wife team left their jobs with Cisco and HP, Silicon Valley firms, to start a nonprofit called Unadeep. For a very modest tuition fee, Indians in small towns could learn computer skills. And from there, tens of thousands of people were recruited or fed into a new firm called iMerit, with offices in towns like Bhubaneswar and Hubli. Workers for iMerit were asked to perform digital tasks, transcribing audio files or identifying objects in photographs. This work had been done before by crowdsourcing operations like Amazon's Mechanical Turk, but iMerit let firms like Meta and Alphabet outsource and offshore in bulk the work of data labeling. This work was tedious. Workers in nondescript offices labeled road signs or traced digital lassos around cars or trees. Some of that work was disturbing. In cities like Ranchi or Shillong and Coimbatore, tens of thousands of workers labeled body parts in surgeries. They categorized types of pornography or degrees of violence. They decided what levels of gore or violence would constitute violations of various terms of service in different countries. This work was monotonous, it was ugly, but the payoff was often quite big. Workers could afford apartments, pay school fees, and save up for motorcycles or cars. But within a few years, that work slowed. This wasn't merely an Indian story. It was happening in Venezuela, in the Philippines, even parts of the rural United States, mostly in the South. And increasingly, the data that fed and now feeds large language models and other systems of machine learning no longer come from human-centered data. Most AI labs, from OpenAI to much smaller operations, now use automatically tagged data, which algorithmically build upon the work that early iMerit workers in India once did. Once a model has seen enough cars or lungs or trees, it can do all but the most complicated edge cases. And that's what a much smaller number of iMerit's workers in India now do. They map complicated crop fields for self-driving tractors. They annotate ambiguous MRIs or CT scans that radiologists in the United States and Europe will then read. The machine here is not a physical one, but rather it's a system of people, computers, and machines working together. You could tell the story through different configurations of each. I think here of the so-called global capacity centers, which have replaced BPOs in places like Bangalore or Gurgaon. The integrated or automated solar panel facilities in the outskirts of Chennai, where robots have largely replaced human factory production. But here, once again, is a different constellation, and it's a post-service constellation of Indian effort and labor and machines, and the basic question of what work may mean for 1.5 billion people. In its fundamentals, and under theorizing to a really great degree, this doesn't strike me as conceptually all that separate from some of the earliest questions about Indian work in a time of early industrialization. Let me return to a different time and bring this talk to a close. After a fairly long hiatus, not complete, but largely the case, mirroring bigger trends in the field, labor history and the question of work more broadly is getting some very good new treatments. The general thrust of that new work, I think, is to explode the category of industrial capitalism in India. This work offers accounts of how different forms and idioms of production, and I think mostly primarily artisanal work and craft, they use this to challenge the terms of labor's incorporation into capitalism itself. Amanda Lenzillo, Abigail McGowan have new work on artisans and craft. I think that's exemplary of that trend. Santosh Kumar Rai's work on Julaha weavers is another. I think there's also a different agenda that we can chart in parallel, one that I think has been present in a lot of early 20th century wrangling with the question of work. For me, what's interesting is how the changing nature of Indian work at different moments is increasingly bound up not only to questions of efficiency and industrialization, but also the dynamics of a larger population that was growing, migrating, and experiencing new strains on land and resources. These questions are really present in a lot of texts that I've been rereading this year. They suffuse the report of the Royal Commission on Labor in India, which is a 1929 colonial undertaking, with really unusual sympathy for the poverty of Indian workers, an appreciation for the fluid nature of migration between the plantation, the village, and the factory, and the question of whether or not work might lead to prosperity for a great many rural Indians or only some. Those concerns and questions are even more prominent in work like Radhakamal Mukherjee's The Indian Working Class, written in 1945. His diagnostics were couched in a particular language of industrial rationalization, but Mukherjee also saw the future problem clearly. He wrote, again in 1945, that cheaper clothes, cheaper corrugated iron sheets, cheaper cigarettes will all be a boon to the Indian masses. At the same time, rational methods of technique, processes of organization which may secure the minimum waste of labor, raw material and power, lead to a general rise of wage level and a reduction of hours for workers. That prediction is far from envisioning a post-work society, but I think it is anticipating, or was anticipating, many of the tensions that existed and percolated in later idioms of national planning. The question of what more efficient work might mean is foregrounded in a moment when independent India's planners and politicians, balancing the various trade-offs of different models of industrialization, modernization, and development, saw issues of human life and its reproduction intimately bound up in the largest ecological and industrial questions of the moment. And I think it's just as clearly present in contemporary notions of work and meaning, where the push to make in India elides the disproportionate value being made in the service sector, and where the notion of a favorite word, time pass, speaks to the uncomfortable reality of so much waiting for opportunity that never actually comes. So I promised at the beginning of this talk that this was not just that this was really just an early attempt to put together a research agenda. So I won't make any larger claims than this, and I'm going to leave it here for now. Big thanks to you for listening to me think through something that is very much in process. I'm looking forward to hear what Professor Tyabji has to say, and to our wider thoughts and questions about what this talk may have called up for you as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ben. We'll move straight on to Nasir's comments. So Nasir Tyabji is an economic historian with interests in the areas of technology, innovation, and also the social aspects of industrialization. He taught at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, from where he retired as the director and professor at the Center for Jawaharlal Nehru Studies. Nasir is the author of several books, most recently Forging Capitalism in Nehru's India, Neocolonialism and the State 1940 to 1970, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2015. So Nasir, over to you. I think you'll have to unmute yourself.
Yes. And thank you. I must start off by apologizing because the internet was cut off in the last 5 minutes or so of Ben's talk. So I have missed out on that, and also at little points in between. But I hope that in spite of that, what I have to offer will be comprehensible and useful. I found an interesting difference between the paper that was sent to me in advance by Zain of Ben's paper, and the short encapsulation of the objects of the paper that was circulated differently. The short encapsulation seemed to me to be much more straightforward, while the paper itself was full of what I would say was full of philosophical musings based on hard facts, but musings nonetheless. So what I'd like to do is to try and bring these musings together and see what it is that Ben, to my mind, is trying to do in this paper and the larger project that he's talking about. Now, obviously, the central point that Ben makes is the question of labor in the Indian context. But as I said, it is not just labor as everyone understands it, because Ben uses an interesting term, ineffable, about labor, which immediately gives it a tone and a content which warns the reader that Ben is not talking about labor in the everyday sense of effort employed in the production process, but something much more than that. And I'll try to come to that again. The point is, as Ben says, that he's looking at come back to the conventional sense of labor in terms of industrialization, in terms of 2 or 3 specific processes. The first, of course, is mechanization, and the second is what I would call automation. In fact, I'd like to ask Ben why he uses this word automatic in the title, because the term that I would have expected was automation. And has my automation would be the term that would normally I would expect in such a context. Now, the point is this, that as Ben says several times, the question right from the 19th century, even amongst the advocates of mechanization, was what would happen to the vast pool of Indian labor if, in fact, mechanization, let alone automation, were to reach its ultimate end. And that is, of course, a question which holds true right from the 19th century up to the 21st century. And it's true, in fact, not just of India and of other countries of the South. It is also true of Western countries where, in fact, automation has taken place. And the question of what workers are to do remains. We've had some absurd examples of this attempt to hide this uncomfortable fact in the last few years, when our Prime Minister, for instance, said that somebody who makes pakore by the roadside is also working in some sense. So that remark itself hides the uncomfortable fact that the lack of purpose for workers is something that even the ruling elites are aware of. And I think that this is perhaps where Ben's use of the word ineffable comes in, to my mind. And that is that, of course, everyone should, in the present day and age, have a living wage, a wage which provides for the family and the reproductive requirements. But surely working towards that aim is a rather narrow aim in terms of what one might expect of humanity in the long term. So the question is, what is the meaning of work which converts it from being labor pure and simple to becoming labor in its ineffable sense? And this is something I think has troubled everyone who has written about it from the 19th century onwards. What do we mean by working in a way which allows each individual to meet their requirements? Now, I belong to a generation where the answer is fairly simple. For those of us, at least, who were brought up as Marxists, the idea was that was a question that would wait for the coming of socialism and hopefully communism later on. So at the present time, we didn't apply our minds to what that might be. We applied our minds to how we would reach that stage where socialism might come. But now that we have seen over the last 30 years that vision or that way of progress is very far away, our attention comes back again to this question of, firstly, creating work for every individual capable of working, and secondly, to ensure that work is not just purely for ensuring physical reproduction, but for enabling individuals in a society to develop themselves in ways which are human. And I come back to the point about the three examples that Ben gave, the ambar charkha and the air conditioning thing, and of course, finally, this system of. Now, I see the difference between these three technologies. I think they're quite different. I think that the ambar charkha was a means in an era of industrialization to hold to allow a large body of the peasantry to keep body and soul alive. So in the cartoon that Ben showed, the man is reported to be saying that my wife is working the charkha and I will help her with it until I get another job. So in other words, the charkha was meant to be a holding operation. And the expectation was that even if the man was thrown out of the textile industry, something would come up again. Now, again, the question of air conditioning, it seems to me that Volkart brothers had an extremely good idea. The understanding was, as was pointed out, that the inhuman conditions of the Bombay textile mills was, of course, partly caused by the heat and the humidity, and of course the absolute lack of concern by the mill owners towards the absolute lack of concern of the mill owners to understand that there was a relationship between the conditions in which their workers worked and productivity. They did not see that there was any link between that. And I'll come back to that because there's another point that Ben had raised earlier on. But let me finally come to the point of the system in the IT industry. Now, this I see as really a cop-out. It is a way of avoiding the question of how people are to be productively and in a satisfactory way employed to produce these cases of occupations, which are really, I would say, shocking in terms of the way in which intelligent human lives are used. And it is a question of some people finding out that there is work, for instance, the mechanical or the work can be done much more cheaply and easily in countries like India. I don't see these as being at all an answer to the question of meaningful work. But let me come back to this question of that Ben said when he compared the textile industry in India and in Japan over 30 or 40 years. And he remarked on the fact that there was a huge increase in the labor productivity 30 years later on, even though there had not been much addition of capital, meaning fixed capital. I think the point here is, and the answer to this lies in Ben's earlier remark, that the two features that characterized the organization of the Bombay textile industry was A, the managing agency system, and B, the jobber system. The managing agency system managed, and the jobbers were the people who drew usually fellow villagers or villagers from their surrounding villages into the Bombay textile industry. Now, I have recently worked quite intensively on the managing agency system. Very simply put, the managing agency was not the owner of the mill. The managing agency was an organization that, for instance, bought yarn for the mill at a particular market rate, sold it to the mill at a much higher cost than it cost the agency, bought the finished fabric from the mill, and then sold that fabric at a much higher cost than the mill had given to them. So in other words, the managing agency was skimming the proceeds of the production process, both at the input side and the output side. Another feature was that the managing agency was, in fact, also the employer. The jobbers were reporting to the managing agent for all their instructions, and there was a nexus between them. So the actual mill management, meaning the technical managers and so on. Now, Ben mentioned that the technical managers are very often the same people as worked in the British mills. Yes, they may have been the same, but they had no authority when they worked in an Indian mill. The authority lay with the managing agent. So there were these lacunae in efficient management that led to the differential productivity of Indian and Japanese, of course, earlier in Indian and British workers, and later much more Indian and Japanese workers. And I would just say, although this is a little off the point, there was one major event in the history of the Bombay textile industry, which I would argue also set the stage for the development of Indian industry as a whole. And that was the 1928-29 Bombay textile strike. Now, the Bombay textile strike, the unions were asking for they had one very simple demand, and that was that there should be the same rate for the same job across the mills in Bombay. That was violently opposed by the mill owners, because what it would have meant was that while the more efficient mills survived, the less efficient mills, if their wage rates were to be brought up to a standard level, they would fall by the wayside. I say this was a critical point in the development, not just of the mill industry, but of Indian industry as a whole, because if that step had succeeded, it would have brought about a change, would have had to bring about a change in the philosophy of the Bombay mill owners. And that change in philosophy would have led them to continue to have a philosophy, the same philosophy, when they moved into more modern industry in the post-independence period. In fact, what they decided to do was to break the solidarity that had existed until recently between management, the Indian elites, and the workers, to break that solidarity and tie up with the British administration of Bombay, which helped them to break the union. And that particular period in Indian industrial history came to the end with the collapse of the Bombay trade union movement as it has built up. But more tragically, I feel, for the future of India, it was a major turning point, or could have been a major turning point in the philosophy of Indian managers. And that would have, to my mind, have led to a totally different strategy in the future. I'm not sure how much time I have left, Zen.
You could take another 5 minutes, Nasir.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that what I find missing in Ben's paper at the moment, although he's left space for it by using words, again, I say, like ineffable, is the complex of socio-political forces that led to the ultimate destruction of the Bombay mill industry in the 50s and 60s, when they found that various pressures were operating. The question is, what were those pressures? And up till now, Ben has not referred to them. Again, in the case of the charkha, the ambar charkha, the problem was that the Khadi and Village Industries Commission, which was supposed to organize cooperatives, the cooperatives, as we know from Indian history, are not at all cooperatives. They usually consist of one big landowner or one big textile yarn dealer who sets up these units under his name. And again, the same thing happens. He sells yarn he sells the cotton in this particular case to the ambar, charkha weavers, spinners, at a higher rate than the market rate. And he buys the yarn from them at a lower rate than the market rate, and therefore effectively squeezes them. So again, it is a question of the political economy of the surroundings of the work process that have led, into my mind, to the collapse of these two initiatives. And as far as the, how shall I put it, the outsourced IT industry, as I've said again, I think that this is really a cop-out. It's a way of creating, in fact, I would say that this switch from manufacturing to the service industry, which Ben has referred to, is really a way of directing attention away from Indian industrialists and the state from dealing with the problems of industrialization in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s, and creating these service jobs, which bypasses the problem. Well, I'll stop there, and I'd be very happy to answer any question from Ben or from anyone else who might be interested.
Thank you so much, Nasir. Thank you. Before Ben responds to Nasir's comments, we also have Anush Kapadia, who will be making a comment. So, Anush, would you like to go ahead?
Hi, Nasir. Hi, Ben. Thanks for this wonderful presentation, and to Zain and Sonal and everyone who's been putting this series together. I think this is the last in this whole batch of lectures, and I just want to recognize the organizers for really doing a stellar job, both on the kind of substantive front and the programmatic front. Just to build on what Nasir was saying, and to perhaps make an intervention into one way to think about Ben's project. This distinction that Kalyan Sanyal has between the need economy, so-called, and the capitalist economy. Now, it strikes me that this tension is very much there in especially the ambar charkha machine, and I'll say how that is in a second. You'll recall that Sanyal's intervention is that in the nature of post-colonial capital is the absence of now a narrative of transition, right? And that there is no movement of labor from the pre-capitalist feudal past to the capitalist and then potentially post-capitalist future. This entire schema is now in suspension for Sanyal. And this is, in fact, not Indian exceptionalism, but this is the case with sort of contemporary post-colonial capitalism per se. The question then becomes how to, not how to, so the population problem is framed, and how will people get work? That whole problem is framed within a narrative of transition, right? That's the problematic. But if we suspend that problematic and say, in fact, there is no transition, the problem then doesn't become how to employ them, but indeed the sort of capitalist or indeed post-capitalist productivist question of how to employ them, but a kind of biopolitical question of how to maintain them, right? And the maintenance is not mere welfare handouts. The maintenance is a kind of work, right? That's why he calls it the need economy. But the horizon of the firm, if you like, in the need economy is kind of simple or maybe slightly expanded reproduction. Certainly not capitalist expansion in the paradigm of, right? And so these machines become very emblematic in an interesting way. Of course, the AC itself is an outcome of a production process, but it facilitates one as well. And the computer, the sort of, an absolute kind of industrial capitalist machine. But the charkha is meant to be a machine in the need economy. A sort of Gandhi, if you like. I forget whether Sanyal refers to Gandhi. Probably being a good Marxist, he would rather slit his throat. But he in a way, Gandhi was prefiguring Sagyal's idea of the need economy, because Gandhi is kind of the proto-theorist of the need economy, right? Not as a diagnosis of post-colonial capital, but of course as a kind of push against a certain kind of capitalist modernity. And the charkha is a machine of the need economy. It's not the machine of a capitalist economy. And so even though, so one can very much look for efficiencies, but you're looking for efficiencies in an entirely different paradigm. So the very fact that one is looking for efficiencies in the charkha paradigm does not bespeak the fact that it's trying to be more productivist in the capitalist sense. But in fact, it's looking for it's sort of normal science, if you like, within another paradigm, a need paradigm, right? And this is why this ambar charkha, actually, I messaged you about this. Like, I actually came across one of these things outside Alleppey. And there was this kind of factory which was more like a kind of diorama of production, and these old women were sort of sitting there chatting, and then when they saw us Firangis come in, they're all stirred into action and then started moving these things. And I was similarly offended at the notion that this could be Gandhian in any way. Right? That is, what is this thing? But in a way, it's a kind of it's one of these strange objects that, in a sense, is caught between two paradigms. It's actually its origins are in the need economy, but it's sort of been Frankensteined into, and of course, it then gets caught up with, as Nasir was saying, the kind of small industries kind of enterprise, right? And it gets dragged into this productivist thing and turns into this kind of Frankenstein monster of a machine, which is kind of has a Gandhian soul, but a kind of mechanistic body or something. I don't know what one would call it, but it's a very interesting. I find it's an interesting point to think about how it's suspended between these two paradigms. So I think the contemporary question, and I'm actually curious to see how. Of course, the Chinese came up with their own kind of brutal solution to this problem, both in terms of population control, but also in terms of massive mechanization. The Indian solution is a more biopolitical one, right? So the problem of labor is like, this is the entire paradigm, of course, of political society that Chatterjee has written about, and so on, right? So this is how the problem of labor is solved. It's about maintenance. No longer, we can talk the talk of transition and make in India, and and maybe some people will transition over, right? But I think there's almost a tacit recognition, at least the nature of our political economy around labor is such that there's a tacit admission that this transition is not going to happen. And that we're just going to have, you get conversations about universal basic income around this and so on, right? So, what I think what's so interesting about this project is it's nudging up against this kind of this moment now where if no one speaks about the need economy directly, but it's kind of bubbling up to the surface in different ways. And I think the different machines, especially this ambar charkha, kind of brings this out. And I'm wondering, actually, I don't know, if Gandhi may have his day in the sun again, not in the sense of all of us spinning cloth, but recognizing that we're going to have to pivot to a kind of need economy that is going to have to be behind the frontier. Because if we're all not every production process is of course not at the frontier in any given economy, but I'm wondering if some version of that, a higher tech version perhaps, but nevertheless in spirit some version of that is going to have to be the answer to quote unquote this labor question going forward. Anyway, just some undigested thoughts that came up from the talk. But thanks.
Thanks so much, Anush. So before we go on to the really wonderful questions that we've got, Ben, would you like to take a couple of minutes just to respond to Nasir and Anush's comments?
Yeah, maybe only a couple of minutes, and these are just first reactions. But thank you both for really rich responses here, and for bearing with the talk that is very much at the conceptualization stage. I guess I want to first just reduce some of the questions in the talk to just two basic questions, one of which is kind of general and one of which is particular. The first is, something that now all three of us have been circulating around, which is what is the purpose of work and what is the structure of an economy when models of progressive transformation appear to be breaking down in reverse or are confounded as they've been for nearly a century now, but are accelerating in a particular way. I am, it's no great surprise that, this is a paper that I am and a project that I'm thinking through at a moment when models of work in the global North and the global South are in crisis, and the solutions to that crisis are imagined very differently. Obviously, I'm in a context where autarky and the return of a kind of productive industrial economy is animating a very strange style of Trumpian politics through tariffs and protectionism. I was thinking, when I was initially thinking about this paper, I was thinking, Anush just mentioned universal basic income, and I was thinking about some of the debates over the last decade or so over what UBI would look like, the way it's captured the imagination of particularly Silicon Valley workers, but also a certain set of, Swiss Alpine capitalist thinkers. There's this general question of kind of what will the end of work look like? Will AI accelerate that work? And Anush, of course, you mentioned the need economy or the maintenance economy, but what does that maintenance economy, if we indeed are doing maintenance, if all we are doing is the work of kind of the biopolitical management of reproduction, will that look the same everywhere? I'm trying to square those questions against another question, which Nasir, you're in bringing us back to the mills, you are reminding me about, but this core question in economic history, or for historically minded economists, of whether or not there is something fundamentally different about the Indian case. That's been a kind of long running question for economists interested in India's. Again, the scare quotes, the failure to industrialize, or the uneven industrialization, or the failure of labor in the Indian context. I'll just say before I get to these questions, because these questions are very good and I want to spend some time with them, and some of them may be more for Nasir than myself. That these were just the three the project that I'm working on has maybe a dozen technologies that would engender different stories, and it sounds like I've zeroed in on three very different ones in this case. I want to point out, and this is largely to just preempt Vikramaditya. Hi, Vikramaditya. I haven't seen you in about a decade. It's nice to see your name here. And Anusha's questions around gender. That the fourth technology that I cut for reasons of time today was the IUD, and thinking about the intrauterine device as a form of a technology for managing reproductive labor. It was the one that was excised because I didn't quite know what to do with it yet. But the questions of the axis of gender feel very important in this project. I see questions around kind of rurality and urban life. Maybe we'll have a moment to speak about that, and about a kind of subaltern relationship to machinery. Should we try to, Zain, should we maybe look at some of these?
So I'll just pick out a couple of questions, and then I'll pose them to both you and to Nasir. Cool. So the first question that I picked up was from Sheetal Ban. So Sheetal asks, could Ben and Nasir talk about the history of the idea of surplus population, overpopulation, and unemployment, and whether this relates to the history of capitalism and industrialization? Also, how do the histories of these terms relate to anxieties about the future of society? Very bound up with your talk. There was another question. There's a question also from an anonymous attendee, saying that Ben's examples are primarily about small machines. Were debates around big machines and big science in the Nehruvian era similarly tied to questions of population, work, and the future? In this regard, could you speak about nuclear research and debates concerning the atomic bomb? So, Ben, if you could take those first, then we can ask Nasir to comment on.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick in the interest of getting to as many questions as possible. So the latter question from an anonymous attendee here around big machines and big science. That's a great question. What it immediately calls to mind for me is less. I think about Robert Anderson's book Nucleus in Nation. I wonder whether where my mind goes in this question is less about the technology itself, but more about the imagination of Indian scientific labor in the same period. Could we bring in a certain idea about Indian scientific production, Indian scientific capacity in this period as being a particular vision of Indian labor? One thing, my mind connects this to something that Nasir said around the kind of IT universe, and maybe a productive fantasy around Indian engineering and scientific capacity, which is the kind of high-end model of labor wherein an extremely capable research system produces high-value labor, which can either be used in the service of national production or, in the case of the outsourcing of engineering work, or the global capacity centers, a kind of high-end model of labor, versus the kind of low-end drudgery mechanical work of things like data labeling, which do seem like they represent the other 80% of this type of work. So I think less about the atomic bomb and more about the structure of scientific research and what that means for labor. Sheila's question about surplus population and overpopulation and unemployment. Those are, I mean, what I think has not been done. There was a wave about 10 years ago when people like Alison Bashford and Matthew Connolly were looking at India as the kind of key case study in global debates around overpopulation, and connecting the kind of late 60s neo-Malthusian scare with the earliest kind of entries of eugenic thought in India, Margaret Sanger's kind of influence in correspondence with Gandhi. What I think that work on overpopulation has not really been focused on the question of labor. It has been focused on the question of reproductive labor very acutely. The kind of compulsory sterilization campaigns are often the kind of high watermark of the excesses of overpopulation theories. So those are the first thoughts here. Nasir, did you have a response either to either of those, or to either the question of science or underemployment?
Question of high-level scientific workers is, I think, a really interesting thing. That you have the establishment of the scientific institutions around Bombay in particular, and you have the establishment of the IITs in the late 50s, early 60s. The presumption, I presume, behind this, particularly at that point in time, as Ben said, was that the high level, or rather the volume of investment in such high level technological training institutes was that they would be employed in the new establishments that would grow up, that would require that kind of expertise. In fact, we find, on the contrary, that from the time almost that the IITs were established, there was a steady flow of talented young Indians educated abroad, and that stream of talent has hardly been used in the Indian context. I'd like to make again a point that perhaps might seem out of place, but I'll come back to it. the Council of Scientific Industrial Research undertook a survey around 1966 of the employees in the R&D establishments of industrial firms. And they were a little taken aback to find that there was a movement from the R&D establishments of the firms into the line management functions on the basis of employment, on the basis that promotion opportunities in the R&D functions were limited. They read and they found to their horror that while earlier on individuals were leaving the R&D function to enter other functions in the firm, now they were moving horizontally. Even if they didn't get a promotion, they just wanted to get out of R&D. In other words, there was no scope for R&D. It appeared in the minds of the young engineers who'd been employed in commercial firms in the 60s. This brings me back to the question that I raised earlier, that because there had been no change in the philosophy of management in terms of a greater attention to technology, even when they went into more technologically demanding industry, they didn't create employment for the technologists who had been trained. As far as population is concerned, I'm sorry, it's not something that I have personally given much attention to. I would just point out that I was interested that if you read the second 5-year plan chapter on population, it says very clearly that there is no particular value in controlling population. And in fact, the history of all Western countries has shown that the period of industrialization has coincided with increasing population growth. So in other words, the planners in 1956 felt that there was no great reason to be worried about the question of population. By the third 5-year plan in the early 60s, there's a dramatic change in attitude to population. And again, the only way one can explain this is to find the declining rate of industrialization by the end of the second 5-year plan, and more importantly, the influence of particularly the Rockefeller Foundation and their philosophy of emphasizing population control, as they called it. So again, I would emphasize that when one looks at the population program and its history in India, one needs to be very, very, one needs to note the effects of political and social aspects on what is actually a scientific problem. That's all I would say.
Thanks, Nasir. I'll just take a last batch of 3 questions since we have just 10 minutes left. So the first question comes from an anonymous attendee. They ask, isn't it worth pulling apart the idea of population in the paper? The charkha, the air conditioner, and AI have shaped the lives of very different demographics within the Indian population. The charkha has shaped the life of the peasant and rural society, while air conditioning and computers or smartphones are part of the lives of only a decidedly upper middle class demographic. So that's the first comment / question. The second one comes from Amrit Dawar, which is, how important is jugad rather than a professionalized technical know-how to the reality of Indian industrialization and the working of industry, and hence the relationship of the Indian population to machines? And the final question is from Merlin Anthony. I am curious about the framing of time pass, especially given the distinction between time pass and passing time. I'd like to know more about the relationship between labor, informality, time pass, and any other readings. So again, Ben, would you like to take that first, and then we'll come to Nasir?
Yeah, so I'll in the interest of time, I'll try to be quick here. Of course, the first question here about pulling apart the idea of population is vital. In a lot of my work, in my first two books, one of the things I've tried to do is to try to figure out ways of telling the story of kind of this is a loose heuristic, but rural production and urban consumption together. I thought about that in food and agriculture in a first book, and how do we analytically account for the relationship between urban consumption and agricultural production? In the second book, what I think about is the production of pharmaceutical commodities in rural North and Central India, and then the creation of a global, but then also urban Indian pharmaceutical market. And with that, I want to think about the ways in which these technologies, yes, reside in and represent different Indian populations, but may tie them together in different ways. I think the charkha is a good example for that, and Nasir pointed out that its existence, or its positing as a fallback technology to industrial labor, that it's a stopgap in some ways, I think gives it a little more. It's not purely a rural technology; it's kind of an embedded and almost ambivalent technology. Yes, the air conditioning is kind of a purely urban phenomena here, but I think one of the things that the last example about data analytics calls to mind is that some of these technologies can live in not tier 1 metros, but they often are in much smaller metros, emerging spaces. That's not to say they're everywhere, but it's just to say that technologies may move in space and they do chronologically. So that's what I'm trying to think about in this project here. For the question of jacquard and time pass, I want to just refer to two readings that I think have been really constructive, and that I've been in the back of my mind in this project. Amit Rai had a book a couple of years back published called Jacquard Time, and one of the key thrust of that book, it's a kind of theoretical accounting of what jacquard is, and it critiques this framing of jacquard as how would I frugal innovation, the idea of hacking, as essentially a managerial concept that's been grafted on. That's been kind of grafted on ideas of labor. It's a stopgap term that is invented. It kind of hails innovation and inventiveness and a certain kind of a psychological, affective approach to fixing things, but is also a stand-in. It's symptomatic of infrastructural failure, of labor precarity, and that book is really great it looks at subaltern, at queer, at feminist ideas around jacquard and different ways of framing that. So that's the best piece I've seen so far. Craig Jeffrey has an ethnography done in Miro on the phenomena of time pass, and similarly constituted as a kind of he looks at it as a way in which educated and underemployed young men navigate liminality, precarious employment. He theorizes it as a space for political action or cultural creativity. I think it's sort of a dated ethnography in some ways, and we might read it very differently in 2025 when we think about the kind of political realities that time pass has engendered than in, I think, 2010 or 2011, whenever that book came out. So there's good work in both of those, and I'm sure many new things that I've not yet read. Nasir?
Again, I have to say that I have not thought very much about time pass, but on the other issue, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what was the first issue. But
The pulling apart the idea of population.
So the first question, Nasir, was
on jacquard.
Jacquard, yeah. So.
I think the tragedy of jacquard, because a lot of it is made in a romantic sense about the way in which jacquard operates at a very low, informal level. But the tragedy of the question of incorporating the ingenuity, because obviously jacquard involves ingenuity, in the modern production process, again brings us back to Indian labor practices, where there is very, very little scope for an individual worker on the shop floor who, through his daily work, comes across ways by which practices of work could be improved from their daily experience. There is very little scope for those ideas to pass up the management scale. The supervisor and the people above them who tend to ignore these kind of questions that come from the shop floor. And that, in fact, is something that the so-called Japanese system of management has realized and is incorporated. But it is very, very rare, if at all, seen in. So very simply put, the ingenuity shown by jacquard and Indians' famous ability at jacquard is wasted in its incorporation when these people are, if at all, incorporated into the modern industrial system, because the lack of receptivity to these ideas by management. That's really what I would have to say.
Okay, thank you so much, both Ben and Nasir, for a wonderfully productive discussion. We'll have to call it, we're closed there.